What is going on, Katella, Majewski, Apush Nation? I am here to discuss the American Revolution and the first portion of the Articles of Confederation notes today. You should be ready to roll with both of those sets of notes in front of you. We're going to make this as quick as possible. I do have some review questions embedded into the PowerPoint presentation in this video. So we start with the American Revolution. And boy, I hope we know the American Revolution takes place from 1775 to 1783. Yes, it technically takes place before the Declaration of Independence even begins, because of course we generally feel like Lexington Concord in 1775 are the first shots of the Revolutionary War, even before we get an official declaration by the Americans. Now, I actually covered the first page in class today, on Thursday actually. But again, the theme. When hostilities began in 1775, the colonists were still fighting for their rights as English citizens. But by 1776, they declare their independence based on Enlightenment concepts, what they consider to be self-evident truths. So, what changes between 75 and 76? Because even as late as 75 after Lexington Concord, Americans are still leaning towards remaining English citizens. Obviously, a lot of that changes as a result of the Battle of Bunker Hill. But before we can get there, Second Continental Congress, remember we already covered in class. What did they do? We already covered that in class as well. Remember, this is formed after the battles of Lexington and Concord. We get the Olive Branch Petition out of them. We get George Washington named the new leader of the Continental Army. We get a new document called the Declaration of the Causes and Necessities of Taking Up Arms. All of these are done by the Second Continental Congress after Lexington and Concord. None of these are obviously going to keep the peace, I guess you could say. None of these are going to prevent conflict from breaking out. Remember, we left off with Lexington and Concord, and if you remember, the British Army retreated back into Boston after those skirmishes. So, we have the British Army in Boston. We have an American army that is besieging it, which means surrounding it from all areas. And the British basically are going to need to come out of Boston and fight. And that's what they decide to do. So we skip over the early battles because they're no longer significant at the bottom of page 1. And we go right into the Battle of Bunker Hill. This is one of the most important battles of the Revolutionary War. You don't need to know the details of it too much. Just know that the Americans park themselves up above some hills overlooking Boston. The British charge up the hills over and over and over and over again, trying to force the Americans to retreat. What ends up happening is that the British have a significant loss of life because they just continue to charge and charge and charge up the hill as the Americans are kind of picking them off. Eventually, the Americans kind of run low on ammunition and they fall back and retreat anyways. So at the end of the battle, the British technically control Bunker Hill, but it actually cost them dearly. They lost way more lives than the Americans did, and ultimately, it's viewed as a British victory in terms of Britain holding the territory, but in the minds and in the hearts of most people, it's come at such an incredible cost that the Americans actually claim victory, and most people agree with them. It's one of the bloodiest battles of the war, and most of the losses occurred were British. The British lost over 1,000 troops. The Americans ultimately only lost a couple hundred. So again, Bunker Hill, it's a bloody battle. What's the significance? Well, here's the significance. After Bunker Hill, that's when the king finally declares the colonies are in open rebellion. That's essentially his declaration of war. So it actually took Bunker Hill for the king to formally declare the colonies in rebellion. And so that's when things really are past the point of no return. That's where peace is no longer an option. The king then hires 18,000 Hessian troops. Remember, those are German mercenaries, and their job was to support British forces, the Redcoats. So he's got his Redcoat army there. They're going to be supported by Hessian mercenaries, and they're also going to be supported by loyalists, Americans who were still loyal to the British king. Now, the colonists were horrified when the king hired Hessian soldiers. Up until this point, most Americans believed that this was a dispute between British citizens. British citizens in the American colonies against British citizens in England, along with their king and parliament. When the king brings in foreign troops to fight, that horrifies the Americans. They were shocked that he was bringing in these professional soldiers. They considered these folks to be particularly brutal. And so they were really outraged by this. And this was one of the reasons why some Americans who were on the fence actually moved towards the Patriot cause because of the king's hiring of the Hessians and bringing them over to fight alongside the British troops. Why did the British do that? Well, the British king did that because... And so after the hiring of the Hessians, who then come over to the American colonies, and again, this definitely increases colonist support for the Patriot cause, Americans make a quick effort to try to invade Canada after they are declared in open rebellion. They fail. That's kind of the American thing. Anytime they get an opportunity, they try to snag Canada for themselves. They never seem to really be successful. But now we get to the Declaration of Independence. Interestingly enough, it was written after the king had already declared the colonies in rebellion. And the irony of it is even by the spring of 1776, prior to it being written, most Americans still didn't want independence. But that starts to shift. Now, I already told you why. One, the hiring of the Hessians. That really put a bitter taste in the mouth of a lot of Americans who are now upset at the king for doing so. Secondly, the British Army burns down a couple of American towns, a couple of patriot towns in New England. When this happens, this kind of total warfare, this burning down of civilian towns, is too far for many American colonists. It just, again, puts a bad taste in their mouth, makes it seem like the British government's being particularly brutal or harsh to British citizens, to these Americans, and so it does, again, push more people towards independence and the Patriot cause. Also, the British promised some slaves freedom if they fought for the British during the Revolution, and of course that's going to push some Southerners towards independence as well, because again, these Americans feel like their rights are being violated. Probably one of the biggest reasons why we see this change from a lack of support for independence to the Declaration of Independence was a famous pamphlet that was written by a man named Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet known as Common Sense, and he wrote it right in the months prior to the Declaration of Independence. Now, Thomas Paine was a revolutionary, and he wanted independence. He was a radical. He didn't believe that they could remain British citizens, and so he was calling for independence early on. And he wrote this to try to convince other Americans to do the exact same, and it was incredibly popular. It spread like wildfire throughout the colonies, and it's considered to be one of the major reasons why Americans' minds are turned towards independence after having not been there before. What did Common Sense say? Well, one, he talked about how Britain's policies were inconsistent. They made no sense. Sometimes they taxed, then they would revoke the taxes. Sometimes they would use brutality. They would ignore colonists' pleas or grievances, and so he said, hey, independence is the only choice. Secondly, Paine argued that Britain was too small to control massive American colonies, that the American colonies were just too large, had too many people, and didn't deserve to be under the control of the British. They ought to be independent. Third, Paine portrayed the English king, King George III, as just this tyrant, this brute, who was abusing American rights, and he depicted him in a really negative way. And then lastly, he talked about, hey, America has a sacred and moral mission or duty to the rest of the world to establish a democratic government, to establish democracy so that the rest of the world could follow in their footsteps. So that was the basic argument of Paine. And there he is, by the way. And what was the significance of it? Well, many of the people in Congress and just general colonists, just everyday colonists, who read it were inspired by it. His words really hit hard with many members of Congress. And many people that were on the fence and were kind of neutral at the time are pushed again towards the Patriot side. They're pushed towards the Patriot cause. You add it up with all the other things that are going on, like the Hessians, like the burning of the colonist towns. And just a short time later, just a few months after Common Sense was published, we start to see the Continental Congress actively move towards independence. A guy named Richard Henry Lee proposes independence. They asked Thomas Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence. Ultimately, that's exactly what he does. They, of course, change it around a little bit. They take out a few things. They add a few things. Ultimately, the final document, the official Declaration of Independence, where the Americans are now officially in rebellion, is approved on July 4th, 1776. That's why, of course, it is our Independence Day, the 4th of July. There's the document itself, the original one, signed, as you can see, by the various members of the Continental Congress, written almost entirely by Thomas Jefferson. Here's the famous image showing the Declaration being approved by the men in the room of the Continental Congress. Of course, you know already, the Declaration of Independence has kind of three parts. The first part, it's the introduction, the preamble. It establishes that colonists have certain rights. They have natural rights like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They have equality. They deserve equality like all English citizens do. They shouldn't be treated, they consider to be lesser than other English citizens. And they argue they have a social contract with the king and parliament, which means that if they feel like their natural rights are being violated, then they have the right to overthrow their government and to replace it with one that will better protect those rights. All of those, of course, are John Locke Enlightenment ideas that Jefferson borrows and uses to justify the American Revolution. Then the second part of the Declaration, after the preamble, after the introduction, is the list of complaints. And there are 27 of them, and these are viewed as the most significant. Of course, we know taxation is way up there. Without representation, we know, the rights to trial by jury and quartering, all of those are issues that are mentioned as well. And then finally, the conclusion, the last part of the Declaration, is the formal Declaration of Independence. It declares that they are breaking ties with England and that the United States has now been created as an independent country. They even made their own flag, the red, white, and blue flag with the 13 stars representing the original 13 states. What's the significance of this declaration? Well, hey, now they can actually receive foreign aid. They can actually get assistance from countries like France or Holland or Russia because before this, France isn't going to help out a country or isn't going to help out the Americans if they think that the Americans might end up going back and being British citizens again. And so when the Americans formally declare independence, now that they're technically their own separate country, France is much more comfortable in supporting them because they don't feel like their money or their resources are going to be wasted by supporting this group of English people who might actually end up becoming English once again in the future. So this is an important step towards receiving foreign aid from France and other countries. All right, take a moment to stop here and to go back through these questions and to just make sure you understand the key parts of what I just talked about in the first few slides. When you're done that, click on the next slide. I'm going to click on the next slide and we're going to get going again. And here we are. Now we're on to the actual fighting in the war, I guess you can say. Now that the Declaration has been signed, there's no more doubt about it. The Americans have rebelled. They are in open revolution against the British government. The British government has sent troops, their own and Hessians, over. This is a fight. The only way that's going to be resolved now is with war. Now, patriots and loyalists. Who are they? What do they believe in? Let's frame it and set up both of these these two sides. All right. So, as we know, about one-third of the Americans are patriots. They support the patriot cause. They support independence. About one-third of the population are called loyalists or Tories. They want to remain loyal to the British king. And then about one-third of the population is neutral. They're not sure which side to join. They're kind of looking to see which one's going to have more success. And then they're going to move towards that side. So in reality, it's one-third of the population, the patriots, fighting against one-third of the population, the Tories, trying to get the neutral one-third, the people in the middle, over to their side so that they can each have the majority. So it's really a fight for the hearts and minds of the American people, especially the undecided American people who weren't sure which side to join at the beginning. Anyways, Tories and Loyalists, there are a lot of them, maybe as many as 100,000. They fought for a return to colonial rule by Britain. They want to stay British. They're loyal to the king. They want us to remain British colonies. They want us to remain under the protection of the British government. Why? Well, they're usually very conservative. They're usually very educated. They're usually very wealthy. That meant that they had benefited more under British rule. So people who usually benefited more under British authority generally wanted to stay under British authority. Again, usually a little more conservative. They're not as interested in dramatic changes to their everyday lives. They're usually more educated, wealthy, and they're usually more connected to the British, to Britain and to the British government. All right. They're also older. Older Americans tended to be more loyalist. They were less interested in revolution. Everybody usually that was associated with the king and his governments, including his colonial government, so like governors, like employees of the governor's office, tax collectors, military leaders. These folks were almost always loyal to the king, and they wanted us to remain loyal to him. And of course the Anglican Church. Anybody associated with the Anglican Church argued for loyalty. Remember, the Anglican Church was considered an extension of the British government. So the Anglican Church was dominated by aristocrats and nobles. Of course, aristocrats and nobles usually stayed more loyal to the king. All right. Where were they strongest? Well, they were strongest, the loyalists, where the aristocracy was strongest. So in places like Charleston, South Carolina, where there's a strong aristocratic tradition. In places like New York, remember, which had a long tradition for aristocracy. Those places usually had more loyalists compared to the rest of the country. They were least numerous in New England. New England was the area with the largest number of patriots. That's where the patriot cause was strongest. And so as a result, New England happened to be the place where loyalists were weakest. Now, the biggest problem with the loyalists is they're really ineffective in getting neutral colonists to join their side. The patriots are masters of propaganda. They're masters of using newspapers, pamphlets, and posters to convince Americans to join their cause, to support their cause. Loyalists are not. Loyalists do a really bad job with connecting with everyday Americans and convincing them that their side is the better side to join with. Patriots are American rebels. They were the ones who fought against British soldiers, and they also fought against loyalists as well. They were obviously most numerous in New England. Now, they are not a majority movement. They're minority at first, but over time, they're going to get more and more people to side with them. So originally, they're only about 33% of the population, but as the war goes on, that number jumps to 40, and then 45, and then 50, and 55, and 60. It's almost as if the longer the war goes on, and the more the Patriots are able to convince people that they have a chance of winning, the more people are willing to take that chance and join with the Patriot cause. Like I mentioned, the Patriots are masters at gaining the support of colonists. They use events that take place that make the British look bad to their advantage. And they use victories that they achieve throughout the war to motivate and inspire more Americans to join their cause. So they're much better at getting the support of the neutral colonists to join with them. Now, you should know something. During the war, about 80,000 loyalists flee the colonies. They're surrounded by patriots. They're surrounded by folks that they're a little bit afraid of. And they're worried for their own safety, especially if the Patriots win this war. So about 80,000 loyalists actually left the country while the revolution was going on. They moved to Canada or they moved back to England. Some of them moved permanently. Others just went temporarily while they waited for the outcome of the war to be decided. This is important because when 80,000 loyalists leave, that meant that a huge number of supporters of the king left the colonies as well, which meant that the Patriots over time actually got larger and larger and larger percentages of the overall American population. So losing these key loyalists during the war actually hurts the loyalist cause, because these were many of the richest and most well-spoken and most influential loyalists, and now they're gone. They're not there to influence neutral colonists to join with them anymore. Anyways, let's get to the fighting. So by 1776 and 77, after the Battle of Bunker Hill, we kind of have this fighting that shifts now from New England, from Boston, down to New York and the middle colonies. So the war started in New England at Bunker Hill, well, at Lexington and Concord, and then Bunker Hill. And then the British Army actually moves from Boston down to New York. They're hoping to split the colonies in half. They're hoping to seize the middle colonies areas and then split New England from the south. They thought it would be easier to divide and conquer. And so what happens is the Americans are forced to follow them. We're going to skip over some of these battles, and we're going to go right into the Battle of Saratoga, because this is the critical turning point battle of the war. So like I said, what happens is the British Army is in New York now. The American Army kind of follows them. Another British Army from Canada travels down to try to make it to New York as well, so that the two British armies can kind of team up together and defeat Washington and the Americans. But before that can happen, the Americans are going to surprise one of those armies at a place called Saratoga. They're going to eventually force the British commander, a guy named Johnny Burgoyne, to surrender because he's surrounded by hostile American troops and he runs out of weapons. He runs out of supplies. He's stuck in the middle of New York on his way to New York City. He's surrounded by enemies. He runs out of food. And ultimately, he's forced to surrender rather than have his army starve. So this is a major turning point for the Americans because they finally achieved a major victory. This is their first major victory of the war. And France, especially, was waiting for the Americans to have a major victory before they would join with them. France's attitude was, we need to see that the Americans can win this struggle before we're going to actually join with them. When Saratoga happens and the Americans are able to get one of the British armies to surrender, that is the turning point the French were waiting for. They're going to join with the Americans shortly afterwards, and more importantly, after a couple of years of kind of back and forth fighting, where neither side was really able to get the advantage here, this revives the colonial cause. It revives Washington and his army. It revives the Patriot cause at a time when the Patriot cause was really kind of struggling, was at one of its low points, when many Americans still were unconvinced that they could actually win. So anyways, Saratoga in New York is the turning point battle because it's going to bring the French into the conflict, and the Americans absolutely needed French support if they were going to win. Another major turning point for the Americans is at a place called Valley Forge. Now, this isn't a battle. This is actually a winter when that the Americans have to get through together in order to win the war. So every year during the summer months, the armies would fight. But during the winter, when it got to be too cold and snowy, roads were pretty much inaccessible. You couldn't use them. And so both armies would camp out for the winter. And then when the weather got better again and it heated up, they'd go back to fighting again. Well, in 1777 and then into the early months of 78, the Americans were camped out at a place called Valley Forge in Pennsylvania. It was a particularly harsh winter. Americans were really struggling to feed themselves. They were really struggling to supply themselves. They didn't have a lot of money. The British blockades were working very well at the time. And so the Americans really had to struggle together to survive this particularly tough winter, this particular low point that occurred. Washington and one of his drill sergeants, or the guy that's in charge of whipping the American army into shape, a German named Baron von Steuben, they basically worked together to keep the army together, to prevent soldiers from deserting, and to train them, and to get them basically turned into a stronger fighting force. So Valley Forge is considered kind of like a gut check moment. It's a time when the Americans are really tested emotionally and physically. They're low on food, they're low on supplies, they don't have a lot of support or money from the Continental Congress at the time because we didn't have a lot of money. We're really starting to feel the negative effects of the war, and then this horrible winter hits at the same time. Only because of the magic of Washington and his amazing ability to keep folks together, and the support of this German drill instructor named von Steuben, do the Americans actually survive this tough winter. And interestingly enough, the army actually comes out much better trained, much better disciplined, and they're a much stronger fighting force afterwards. So Saratoga is a turning point, a major turning point for the colonists' cause. It brings France into the war, And then, of course, Valley Forge is another test of the American gut. And the Americans were able to withstand that harsh winter and actually come out of it more inspired, ready to fight the British in a more effective way. Anyways, we should also mention that around this time, the Americans actually write their first government. It's known as the Articles of Confederation. We'll get into it next set of notes. But before we get into that, we need to finish up these notes, and that means we need to talk about France becoming an American ally. So in 1778, France officially agrees to join the United States and to ally with them. Why? Well, they wanted revenge against Britain. All right, they had been beaten by Britain throughout the 1700s in the French and Indian War and conflicts before that. Now they see an opportunity to get some revenge, to weaken Britain, their longtime rival. First, they secretly supply money and weapons and other supplies to the Americans to help the war effort. Then, after the Declaration of Independence and Saratoga, they officially, formally sign the Franco-American Alliance of 1778. France promised to recognize U.S. independence, and they promised to give the United States financial and military support in their fight against Britain. Now, hey, Benjamin Franklin was instrumental in getting this signed. He was over in Paris while the war was going on. His sole job was to try to get the French to join with them because Americans knew how important this was, and he succeeds thanks to the American victory at Saratoga. After France joins, other countries join in as well. It becomes a world war, and pretty much everybody jumps in on the American side against Britain. Spain and the Netherlands enter the war against Britain in 1779. And these things are critical because now, hey, Britain's having to fight a world war. What I mean by that is Britain's got to fight in the Caribbean now against France, Spain, and the Netherlands. They've got to fight in India and in Asia against France and the Netherlands. They're having to fight in places in North Africa and the Middle East now as well. And so it's not just a fight against the Americans anymore, it's a worldwide conflict that Britain's having to fight and spend money and waste lives everywhere. So this alliance with France is such a critical turning point. It's key to the American victory. Hey, while we really focus on Washington and the major armies, you do need to know this is a war that is fought all over the American colonies. There were fights out west. Usually those were American troops that were fighting against Indian allies of the British. The most famous examples are where American forces fought against the Iroquois. The Iroquois were led by a man named Joseph Brant. He had assumed an American name. Americans nicknamed him the Monster. But he was the guy that was fighting on behalf of was leading Native Americans against American forces. And so most of the fighting out west actually involved Americans fighting against natives like the Iroquois that were loyal to the British. The American Navy as well was small, but it did do some damage to British merchant ships. We did have what were called some privateers, which are almost essentially like pirates that were fighting for us, raiding British ships and bringing those supplies back to American ports. But quite frankly, the major naval battles during this conflict usually didn't involve the Americans. It was usually British naval forces against France. Sometimes the Spanish and the Dutch fought against Britain as well. All of this means that the British now are having to waste resources fighting all over the world, fighting all of these enemies, not just the Americans anymore. So they're not able to focus on the American colonies nearly as much, and they're more willing to accept peace when it eventually happens. So as the war becomes more desperate for the British, they change their strategy again. Remember, they originally started in Boston in the New England colonies. Then they moved down to the Middle Atlantic to try to split the Americans in half. Well, remember, that failed when the British had to surrender one of their armies at Saratoga. So now they changed plans again, and they decided to go down to the south, which they thought was the last place where they had a lot of support. So they load their troops onto ships, they send them down now to Charleston, South Carolina, and the Americans, of course, follow them there as well. All right. They also, the British, name a new commander, a guy named Lord Cornwallis. Cornwallis eventually realizes that they don't have a lot of support in the South either. And so what Cornwallis does is he actually starts to retreat his army back towards Virginia again, back up north, trying to get to the coast, trying to see whether he can get to the protection of the British Navy, and of course American troops are following him the entire way. Ultimately, General Cornwallis is trapped by American forces and a French army and a French fleet that arrive in the American colonies by 1781. So Cornwallis is trapped in Virginia. He's surrounded by American armies, 2 of them. He's surrounded by a French army as well. And then the French fleet blocks him in and makes it unable for him to reach the safety of the British naval ships along the Atlantic coastline. So he's trapped. He's stuck. And ultimately, at the famous Battle of Yorktown, he is defeated. And so, while Saratoga is the turning point, Yorktown is a very significant battle as well because it's the battle that officially ends the American Revolution. So Bunker Hill was the first major battle where the king declared the colonies in open rebellion. And then Saratoga is the middle battle, the turning point, because that's what convinces the French to join. Yorktown is the concluding battle, because after Yorktown there are no more British armies left in the American colonies. They have all been defeated. And this is what's going to finally force the British to accept defeat, to accept surrender. Speaking of surrender, this is Cornwallis, the British commander, surrendering to Washington and the Americans after his defeat at the Battle of Yorktown. And so what a shocker, what an embarrassment for the British. Everybody expected them to win this when this revolution started. Instead, it's been one failure after another. The Americans gain more confidence and more hope and more optimism and more strength as time goes by. So that following the Battle of Yorktown, the British really have no more choice. They are ready to accept peace. And that's exactly what we're going to get in 1783. Both sides meet at Paris, France, and they sign the Treaty of Paris. Now, hey, don't be confused here. Remember, we had the Treaty of Paris that ended the French and Indian War in 1763. This is the Treaty of Paris that ends the French and Indian... This is the Treaty of Paris 20 years later, 1783, that ends the American Revolutionary War. So 2 treaties of Paris, they did 2 very different things. Make sure you can separate the 2. And Britain is ready for peace because, hey, they're getting their butts kicked, all right? They've already kind of had heavy setbacks in India, in the Caribbean, in the Mediterranean. They've had losses. The British government collapses because things are going so poorly and is replaced by a new political party. The Whigs come back into control again. The Americans had won at Yorktown, so the final British army had just surrendered. And so the Brits are forced to accept peace. They really had no choice, otherwise they stood to lose a lot more territory around the world. The Treaty of Paris is signed in 1783. What does it do? Well, Britain is forced to formally recognize American independence, which means they acknowledge that the Americans are their own independent country, and they will not try to force them to become colonists again. It also gave the Americans massive amounts of land. All of the territory that the British had acquired from France during the French and Indian War now is going to belong to the Americans. So everything on this map right here that is white now becomes part of the United States. Britain keeps Canada, but the Americans get all of this territory. This now becomes the United States. There were some disputes between the U.S. and Spain about this area, but for the time being, it belonged to the United States exclusively. All right? The Americans did promise some things as well. So they get all that land, they get their independence, but they promised to the British, hey, we're going to let the Loyalists come back to the United States. They can live here. We won't persecute them. We won't abuse them. We won't punish them. We won't put them in jail for supporting the king and supporting the other side. We promise to treat them fairly. Also, during the war, remember how 80,000 Loyalists left the country? Well, what the Patriots did is they took all that Loyalist property that was left and they sold it. And then they used those profits to help fight and win the war. The Americans promised, since that's technically theft, they stole property that didn't belong to them, that they would reimburse these Loyalists for any property damages that they had suffered. The U.S. also promised that they would pay back debts that they had accrued before the Revolution started. So if Americans owed money to a British business or bank, the Americans actually said, hey, we'll pay that money back because we owed that before the Revolution took place and we want to pay off our debts. Now, hey, Americans agree to all these three things, but ultimately they really didn't follow through on any of them, and it's going to be one of the reasons why we're going to have further conflicts with Britain down the road. All right. Women, I should say France formally approved the terms. Britain agreed to the terms. America obviously supported the terms. It ultimately was a big victory for the Americans. They're the ones that are really going to benefit from this. Even France doesn't really benefit much from it. In fact, they're going to be dealing with their own French Revolution about a decade later. All right. Let's stop and review here for a second time. Again, make sure you know these terms. I should say make sure you know these questions or the answers to these questions because they're going to be critical as we move forward. All right, American society during the war. Well, of course, there are significant casualties on both sides. About 250,000 Americans fought during the war. About 10% of those Americans died. Significantly more than the number of British troops that died. But, of course, there were a lot more Americans fighting. Patriot troops did outnumber the British, but Patriots were oftentimes poorly fed and clothed. That's one of the reasons why Washington is such a master. He's able to keep this army together despite the fact they were constantly low on weapons, on food, on clothing, on ammunition, and yet he's still able to motivate, inspire, and keep the army together to fight against this supposedly more superior British force. Economy, well, African Americans fought on both sides. Native Americans usually fought with the British. Women played a significant role in this conflict. Usually women were in charge of managing farms or businesses while the men were away fighting. Some women actually volunteered their time as cooks or nurses with the American army to do what they could to support. Some women start to become more politically active. They start to speak out more and declare that women ought to have rights as well in the name of the American Revolution. Some women, a handful, actually disguised themselves and tried to fight for the American army. A famous example is Molly Pitcher. There's a story of a woman whose husband died on the battlefield. She was helping out as a nurse and a cook. When she saw him die as he was loading the cannon with gunpowder, she raced over, she took his spot on the battlefield, and she fought alongside him. Or I should say, she took his role and did his job for the remainder of the battle. That's a good example of how women were willing and able to do almost anything they could to support the war, even though oftentimes they were prevented from fighting directly most of the time. Deborah Sampson, another great example of a female who actually dressed herself up and disguised herself as a man so that she could actually fight during the war alongside her fellow Americans. Women supported the cause in a lot of other ways. I told you, they really kind of just managed and took care of the home, the farms, the businesses. They tried to provide as much emotional support for males as they could. They would write letters. They would sew and knit things like clothing and socks and send those to the American army. Really, they would bake pies and other things and send those to the army as well. Really, anything they could do to do their part to help the war effort, they did. Some famous examples of that: Abigail Adams, John Adams, the future president's wife, kind of becomes a spokesperson for women during the war and especially afterwards. In fact, as the Declaration of Independence was being written, she tried to kind of pressure her husband to make sure that women were represented in the Declaration of Independence and make sure that women's rights were being respected as well. This is a sign that women are starting to become more outspoken and to speak up more on behalf of themselves in what has up to this point been in a completely male-dominated society. We'll talk about these interactions between Abigail and John in class. Because they're really, really famous. All right. Anyways, African Americans, about 5,000 fought for the Americans as well. Only about 30,000 fought for Britain. Why? Well, because the British promised a lot of these African Americans freedom if they did. Here we can see a couple of images. This one is an American image. I should say this is an image of an African American fighting for the American cause. Here you can actually see another example of an African American patriot fighting this time for Britain against the American army. All right, so again, African Americans most fought for Britain because they were promised freedom from slavery if they did. But there were some that fought for the Americans as well, including some who also were promised freedom by their American masters. Native Americans, remember, most who fought the war sided with Britain because they viewed the Americans as their greater threat, their greater enemy. They were worried about American expansion into their lands, and they thought Britain would be a better side to join with to prevent Americans from further expanding westward. The Iroquois are the most famous example, although most Native Americans fought with the British. After the war, many of the Iroquois fled to Canada to try to escape what they thought would be vengeful Americans intent on getting paybacks on them for having sided with the British. That's going to do it for us, folks. I do think, why did the U.S. prevail in the war? That's something that's very important, and that's something that you do need to cover in those notes. In fact, let's go through the actual notes where it talks about why the Americans ended up being so successful. And that's actually the last couple of pages. So, page 11. Why did the U.S. prevail in the Revolutionary War? Well, first off, there's some diplomatic reasons. One, the Declaration of Independence was key. It opened the door to Americans gaining support from countries like France, which was critical to ultimate victory. Secondly, that alliance that I just mentioned was important. The U.S. desperately needed foreign support. They needed weapons, they needed ammunition, they needed food, and they needed actual troops to help them, not only land troops, but also naval troops, and that's what France provided them. The U.S. got money from France. That was critical as well. And again, Benjamin Franklin was so important in making sure that happened. Politically, the British government was inept. The king was not very strong. The British prime ministers at the time were very weak. I mentioned that there was a lot of division between the political parties in Britain, so there was not a lot of unity or support for the British cause, even in Britain. American leaders did a much better job of using propaganda and information to gain support of neutral colonists, so that by the end of the war, about 75–80% of the American public is in open support of the Patriots. Each of the colonies supported the cause as much as they could. The Second Continental Congress created the Articles of Confederation, which at least established a government that helped us to win the war. All right? Militarily, the U.S. was just too large to conquer and occupy. Britain could capture large cities, but they could not control the countryside, which is where the American army oftentimes hid out, did those hit-and-run attacks on them, and actually was able to recruit new members. The British were unable to seize New England in 1775. When they were unable to do that, they kind of changed their strategy, moved to the middle colonies. That didn't work, and so ultimately they've got to move to the southern states. That doesn't work. The moral of the story is Britain didn't really have a strong strategy, and more importantly, it was a strategy that changed over time, which meant, again, they were not very organized, not very coordinated. The British thought they could depend on loyalists and Native Americans. That did not work out for them. The natives were not as strong as the British expected them to be. Let's give credit to George Washington. Washington was so inspiring. He was such a motivational leader. He kept this army together despite multiple losses, and he was able to achieve victories right when the Americans needed them. Almost like a shot in the arm, a shot of adrenaline. That's what Washington would provide the American cause during those low points. Britain had to fight not only the Americans, but the French, the rest of Europe eventually. When it turns into a world war, they're unable to succeed. They didn't have a great amount of communication with their armies in North America. The distance, the Atlantic Ocean, were huge obstacles they struggled to overcome. And finally, the British Navy's blockade, the French Navy's blockade, I should say, finally sealed the fate at the Battle of Yorktown. Yorktown was the final nail in a coffin for the British military. They're forced to accept peace at the Treaty of Paris afterwards. Anyways, memory aid for all of the events leading up to the Revolution. I told you I like to use memory devices sometimes, and so do the Sage Notes. The Sage Notes have a little simple memory device for you if you're struggling to remember all the steps that lead us to the Revolution. All right, folks, we're going to jump over now to the Articles of Confederation. And we're going to make that move over there right now. All right, so give you a moment to change those notes as we jump over to the next set of notes, the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. All right, folks, so we are moving over to the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. Now, hey, the Articles were technically written while the Revolution was going on. And so they are technically our first system of government in this country. But right after the Revolution has ended, now that Americans have established their own country and they've won their independence, they've won their freedom, what we're going to notice is that there are certain changes, I guess you could say, that take place in society that are motivated by the ideas of the Revolution. So let's go through some of those right now. First off, social changes. Well, first off, 80,000 conservatives, as you know, loyalists, left the country during the Revolution. Some of them never returned. In fact, most never did. What that means is that this huge roadblock to democratic ideas, this huge obstacle, all of these wealthy and powerful loyalists are no longer there. So it makes it so much easier for radicals, patriots, to establish more democratic governments within the new United States. All right, so other examples of how democratic ideals, equality, freedom, spread their way into American society. Well, right after the Revolution, we see this growth of anti-slavery societies. Now, it's almost entirely in the North. And the original ones were formed by Quakers. Quakers were our original abolitionists, people that fought to abolish slavery. It was abolished. It was gotten rid of during or right after the American Revolution in many northern states. Pennsylvania became the first state to abolish it fully in 1780. A number of states granted what were, basically what it said was, those who were slaves before the law remained slaves, but children of slaves would be free. And as time developed, gradual emancipation took place, which meant gradual freedom. So over time, more and more former slaves were freed in Pennsylvania. All right. Massachusetts as well, thanks to a famous case called the Quock Walker case, basically ended slavery there. Most of New England abolished slavery. So during and after the Revolution, we see these revolutionary ideas of equality, freedom for all spread throughout society, especially in the North, and we see the decline of slavery in those states. Other examples of that, well, you're going to notice we're going to pass something called the Northwest Ordinance later that's going to officially bar slavery from any new states in the North. Even the slave trade is going to be abolished in the Constitution as part of the Constitution. So all of those are examples of how slavery is on the decline in the North, how it's diminishing or it goes away entirely, and we believe that that was absolutely inspired by the events of the American Revolution, where many rebels thought that those ideas ought to spread across all Americans, not just white males. In addition to that, we start to see the movement of African Americans, especially to the North. We have 250, because of these anti-slavery laws, we have as many as 250,000 free blacks who lived in northern states during and after the Revolution. Now, hey, they're free, but many of them still experience incredible discrimination and racism, even in northern cities, especially when it came to things like jobs and education. Just because they were free didn't mean that they necessarily were not discriminated against in the workplace and in education. But anyways, we do suddenly have this huge number of free African Americans We develop a number of strong African American communities in many of the cities of the North. And the center of free African American life were what were called black churches, churches that were frequented mostly by African Americans. They became kind of the center of African American life and activism. In fact, many of the religious leaders, the church leaders in the African American community, also ended up becoming political leaders as well. Now, there were thousands of slaves that were freed in the South as well by patriots in the South who believed that those ideas ought to spread to their slaves as well. But despite the fact that a few thousand were freed, the overwhelming majority, the millions, remained slaves because in the South, slavery was just too, I guess you could say, important of a system to the Southerners, to part of everyday life for them to just get rid of it entirely. So other than a handful of slave owners who freed their slaves in the South, most remained slave owning. So we start to see a difference in the North and the South, right? Northerners move away from slavery beginning with the Revolution. Southerners oftentimes maintained it and or continued to defend it. All right, other examples of equality. So there were these groups in society that were called secret societies. They were usually made up of wealthy, privileged, aristocratic men. They were almost like almost like a fraternity for the wealthy people in society. And so there was one called the Masons. There was a really well-known one called the Order of Cincinnatus, or the Cincinnati Society. George Washington was a member, for instance. So were other members of his army, of his military. And after the war, these are viewed as very undemocratic. A lot of middle and lower class Americans were worried, hey, these people in the secret societies, like the Cincinnati Society, they have their own oaths of allegiance, they have their own handshakes, they have their own relationships with one another, and they were worried that they would do things, make decisions, or come to agreements behind closed doors as part of these meetings. And that seemed undemocratic. It seemed like we should not have these special people in these secret societies who might be making decisions for all of the country and all of the people during these meeting times. So there was an effort to get rid of these societies, of these organizations after the war, because they're viewed as undemocratic. And many states also reduced property requirements for voting in the name of equality, so you didn't have to own land anymore if you wanted to vote. So voting becomes more equal after the Revolutionary War as well. Also, we have an end to what's called primogeniture and entail. Primogeniture was the idea that the eldest son got everything when the father died. That's viewed as unfair to the other sons and to the other members of the family. So that's going to go away. That was a tradition that was popular in England, but by 1800 it's pretty much gone in the United States, because it was viewed as aristocratic and unfair. And then we have some changes to separation of church and state as well. We start to see Americans spreading these ideas, these important democratic ideas to them, these Enlightenment ideas, like the separation of church and state. And interestingly enough, it's Jefferson again. He writes a very famous what's called Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. It separated political decisions from religious decisions. It becomes a model that other states used as well. We start to see the decline of some of these powerful churches, like the Anglican Church. It starts to decline in power and authority even more, and it eventually becomes a relatively small, insignificant church in this country. The Puritan Church as well, Congregational churches, lost some of their control and power as more and more states disestablished churches, which meant you didn't have to pay money to that church any longer. And as the influence and power of those churches no longer were able to influence political decisions. State government as well starts to take on democratic ideals. So we have a federal government, the Articles, but each state had their own individual state government too. And we notice strong examples of democracy in these state governments when they're created after the war is over. First off, almost all the governments have three branches. They would have a strong legislature. Those are the people who are elected to Congress or to the Assembly or to the legislature by the people. They were the ones that were given the power to make laws. Why? Because these patriots believed power ought to rest with the people, with the masses, and so the legislature should have most of the power since the people voted those people into the legislature. All right? They voted for their representatives who represented them in the legislature, so if the people were unhappy with their representative, they could always remove him by vote. So therefore, because democratic ideals are so powerful at this time, the legislature was usually created to be the most powerful of the three branches. Governors were weak in state government, and that makes sense too. Remember, the governor is the executive. He's the one that enforces the laws. Just like the king had been the executive and had enforced laws on the colonists. And so, in the minds of these patriots, a strong executive is bad. He can be tyrannical. He can be abusive. He violates the rights of the people. And so they made their own governors, the individual that's in charge of enforcing their laws, very weak. Finally, judicial branches. Each state usually had their own judicial branch that was used to kind of decide if there were conflicts between members of that particular state. Each state is sovereign, is its own little independent republic at first, which means there's not as much unity, and each state kind of had a lot of say over the affairs that happened in their boundaries. Also, most states had a Bill of Rights. These were a list of individual rights that every person had that ought to be protected by the government, that the government could not take away. That model, obviously, is going to be used by the Americans down the road when we write our own Constitution. But the whole idea here was Enlightenment concepts again. Every person has certain natural rights that can never be taken away, and a democracy is going to work to preserve those, and so they wrote those rights down in what become known as Bills of Rights. Alrighty? One last thing that ought to be mentioned here. The Native Americans are in a really tough spot after the British are defeated and the Americans win the Revolution, because many of those Native Americans had supported the British. And so, as I mentioned, many Native tribes, especially the Iroquois, tried to relocate to Canada to flee American vengeance, I guess you could say, to try to get away from the Americans because they worried that the Americans would take revenge on them and they would no longer have the protection of the British military to stop the Americans from doing so. So we have changes to Native American populations, and many Native Americans kind of flee westward or flee all the way actually up north into Canada to try to get away from what they consider to be hostile Americans. Women, well, hey, equality for women was not absolute. It was very incomplete. Abigail Adams had demanded, her and other women had demanded that women receive equal legal rights with men. That was slow to develop. And it was very incomplete. There were some gains for women, but for the most part, they were very much unequal. They were very much inferior to men, according to the legal system. What did emerge for women after the war was this concept of Republican motherhood. This was the idea that women were morally equal or maybe even superior to men, and that therefore it was a woman's job to stay at home, to have a lot of children, to raise those children, because she was so moral, it was her job to spread these moral values onto the next generation of young boys that were rising up. This became known as Republican motherhood. So a woman's role is to stay at home, to have children, to raise those children in a very moral and ethical way, to spread the virtues of democracy, equality, and freedom so that the next generation of young men in this country would continue to fight for the same ideals that the Patriots had done so as well. That's a good concept. I like the idea of women teaching, the future generations, of mothers teaching the future generations to continue what their fathers had started. But what this does is it limits women. It basically says, woman, hey, your place is in the home. Your place is having kids. You shouldn't be working. You shouldn't be getting an education. You should be doing what you can for your country, and that means staying at home and raising those children. So in a way, I think it kind of actually reduces women's rights and female equality by putting pressure on them to stay in the home. Despite that, there were some benefits for women. The most famous is femme covert. This was the idea that women could not own property if they were married, even if they had inherited the property. Their husbands took control of it upon marriage. So femme covert does start to take place in society. Eventually we're going to get rid of it, but at the time it was still popular, and another good example of how women did not receive that absolute equality. Constitution making. All right, well, each of the states had to draft their own government, and they would write their own constitution, which is a written system of laws. Every state had sovereignty, which means power, was based on the idea of republicanism. Remember, republicanism is where people vote for representatives who then go and vote for them in Congress. And then each few years, the people have an ability to either re-elect that representative or to replace them with somebody that they prefer. So this is a basic idea of the Enlightenment and John Locke. This was a basic idea of Montesquieu and separation of power. And so, of course, after the Revolution, since the Americans are just overwhelmed with Enlightenment ideas, they obviously created each state government based on that system. What did each state also have? Well, I mentioned most included a Bill of Rights. Most included regular elections, like maybe every year, so that the people could always have a say in who was being represented, and they could kind of evaluate the job that their representatives were doing. There were weak executives because, remember, the colonists believed executives abused their power, like the king had done, and they wanted to prevent a governor or a future person in charge from doing the same thing to them that the king had just done. Judicial branches usually were weaker as well. The legislature was all powerful, since that was the branch that answered most directly to the people. Generally, a lot of these states passed constitutions that gave the people out west, the poorer folks, the less connected people, usually more representation than they had had previously. All right, now, despite these positives and changes in government that occurred in the United States after the Revolution, the 1780s was a very tough time for Americans, and particularly for the country under this system of laws known as the Articles of Confederation. We had a lot of challenges. You need to understand something. We are the new kids on the block in the 1780s. We're the new country. We're the baby. We barely have a military. We've used basically every resource we have to win independence. We're broke. We're in debt. We are divided still in a lot of ways. We're not incredibly unified. We have all of these issues and problems going on. And oh, by the way, we have a government at the time, the Articles of Confederation, that is very weak and unable to respond to these crises. So let's start with the problems the U.S. faced after the Revolution, beginning in the 1780s. So, one, right after the war ends, we experience a ridiculous depression, which is a decline in our economy. And it is devastating to the economy of the United States. One, the federal government had borrowed a ton of money to win the war, so we had gone into incredible debt. Most of that debt went to France, but other European countries as well. Well, now that the war is over, that interest is going to start adding up. We got to start paying off that debt. Secondly, the states had borrowed money as well. Each individual state had borrowed money to win the war as well. And so some states, like Massachusetts, had huge state debts because they had borrowed more in an effort to win. So we have these huge debts that have added up. Now we got to figure out a way to pay them back. Secondly, in the 1780s, for the first time, Americans were able to acquire credit for themselves. Many of these folks borrowed money in order to pay for food or for other necessities during and after the war. Well, a lot of these folks borrowed more than they were able to pay back. And so not only are our federal government and our states in debt, but a lot of Americans were in debt for the first time as well, which means they don't have money to spend on goods. Next, we had a lack of money, a lack of currency. We had been using the British pound up to this point. Well, now we've got to develop our own monetary system, our own money. And that's difficult to do. It's difficult to establish your own paper money and have everybody around the world accept it as legitimate, because a lot of countries knew the U.S. economy was bad at the time, and they were worried that American money might lose its value if the U.S. economy continued to go down further and further. On top of that, we start to see the foreclosure on farms. As more Americans get into debt, Some of them begin to lose their property. They lose their homes, they lose their businesses, and they lose their farms. Farming was one of the ways the U.S. was hoping to make money and pay off some of this debt. And so as more Americans lose their farms, it becomes harder and harder for the government to be able to pay off all of its debts because it's not receiving as much tax money and things like that. Inflation, high prices. Inflation is when prices climb at a very high rate very quickly. Oftentimes when an economy is struggling, you'll notice that inflation might occur, especially in a new country. And this is exactly what happened with the Americans. We experienced higher prices than we had had before, which means goods are less affordable and harder to acquire. And the biggest problem is Britain. Britain is in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. We had been getting all of our goods, or at least most of our goods, from Britain up to this point, and the British knew it. They knew we didn't have the ability to make a lot of products ourselves, and the products that we did make were usually not as high quality. They were usually more ghetto, I guess is a good way of putting it. And so the British, knowing that they had just lost the war, wanted to kind of hurt us after the fact. They wanted to kind of... They weren't accepting of their loss, and they were trying to make life harder for us. So what their merchants did is they sent way more supplies than we needed over to the United States for sale. And oftentimes they were able to sell their products, which were better quality, for cheaper prices because they were able to make them for less. And so Americans oftentimes bought the products that were cheapest, which meant they were still buying British goods instead of buying the American alternatives. So Britain's kind of smart here. They flood our markets with their products after the war, which were cheaper than American goods, and most Americans ended up still buying from Britain, which obviously is going to slow down our country, the U.S.'s ability to recover from all of those debts. Oh, in addition to that, the Americans lost markets in the British Empire. The U.S. did try to find new markets to sell their goods in that they had previously been blocked from by the British government. But we lose a lot of buyers. We lose a lot of people in Britain that were buying our goods that maybe we counted on previously. All right, so economically, we're in debt. We're struggling to make money. People are losing their homes and their farms. We're buying British goods still, which is killing American businesses and manufacturers, and we're struggling to trade our products in England because we're no longer British citizens. In addition to that, we had a bunch of foreign policy challenges. We had a bunch of challenges from all of the countries of the world, especially the major countries who all feel like they can kind of pick on us and take advantage of us in our weakened state. First off, Britain. Obviously, they are bitter about losing the war. All right, and they are bitter that they had to give up the American colonies, and they're not just going to be like, okay, Americans, we lost, now you get everything that you want. No, they make life as difficult as possible for us. First off, they refuse to sign trade deals with us. That's a commercial treaty. So they refused to sign any new trade deals with us, which meant oftentimes Americans were prevented from trading in England or selling their goods there. In addition, they wouldn't repeal their navigation laws. So they actually tried to say, hey, Americans, you still have to send all your goods to England first, or we won't trade with you at all in the future. When the Americans didn't, when the Americans would not sell their goods in England first, when they would go to France or other places to sell them, England responded by cutting off all trade in the Caribbean with the Americans. They forbid American ships from docking. They refused to accept any American goods. So again, Britain, bitter, like a bitter ex-boyfriend, won't make new relations with the Americans, won't trade with the Americans, and is still demanding that the Americans try to trade with England first. On top of that, British troops actually stayed in some of the forts along the western frontier that they had promised to leave. And in some instances, they gave weapons, ammunition, or money to American Indians to actually encourage Indian attacks against Americans living on the western frontier. So again, Britain goes back on its word that it would leave the forts along the along the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes, and instead not only stays in those forts, which technically belong to the United States, but then encourage Indians in the area to launch attacks against Americans, so American expansion westward would slow down. Here we can see Americans, these are American forts, right? Now, this is American territory. These are American forts, but the British refused to give those up and actually encourage attacks from them on the Americans, even though the war is over and even though they have no business being there. Now, you might say to yourself, well, why did the Americans allow that? Well, the Americans are in such disarray at the time. They're having so many other problems. They don't really have the funds or the means to even send armies up to that area to kick the British out, and the British know that. All right? In addition to that, we have other issues. Congress can't regulate commerce between states. So each state basically is allowed to trade with whomever it wants to. Some of these states actually signed trade deals with England, even though the federal government didn't have one of its own. So states were actually signing deals with one another or with England, even if those deals might hurt the overall economy of the United States. So states were operating in their own best interest, and Congress, which is so weak under the Articles, was really unable to stop it. Guys, in fact, in some instances, states were signing deals with other states and actively planning on potentially invading other states, if you can believe it. For instance, New York forced New Jersey and Connecticut to pay taxes to use their port. New Jersey and Connecticut were so outraged by this that for a time they actually signed an agreement where they were planning on invading New York and taking the port for themselves. So we're in a lot of disarray. We're having a lot of chaos. We're getting beaten up by the British. We're getting picked on by the Brits after the war because everybody knows we're in a little bit of a state of chaos. We're in a little bit of a state of disarray. Oh, by the way, our economy is in shambles after the war as well. All right. Spain actually closed the Mississippi River off to us as well in 1784 because we refused to pay certain fees to them in order to use the river. They also claimed a portion of the United States as their own. They believed Britain had taken that from them illegally, and now that Britain was no longer around, that they ought to have that territory back. And they too worked with American Indians along our western frontier, and they would encourage attacks along our southern boundaries, our southern states' western frontiers, to try to slow down American expansion into those territories because the Spanish did not want to see a lot of Americans in those areas. Otherwise, they worried they would lose their claims to that land. They actually encouraged some southwestern Americans in the Southwest, to potentially create their own independent country or independent states that might be loyal to Spain instead. So Spain's picking on us. This is the issue. Spain controls the Mississippi River at the time. We control the land up to the Mississippi, but they control the Mississippi River. So when our farmers out west wanted to get their crops down to the markets, they had to send them down the Mississippi River. There were no roads going west to east at the time, so they had to use the Mississippi River. Well, Spain knew that, and Spain charged those farmers fees. Those fees were high. The farmers didn't want to pay it. When we protested, Spain actually cut off the port of New Orleans to us and said, from now on, you're no longer able to send your products down the river. You're no longer able to export them out of New Orleans and get them to the markets where they can be sold. And Spain claimed this territory here for themselves. They believed it belonged to them, that the British had taken it illegally. Now that Britain's gone, they think the U.S. should hand it over to them. The United States disagreed. They said, hey, that land is ours. And so this is a reason why the Spanish would encourage Indians in this area to launch attacks on American settlements so that fewer and fewer Americans would move into this disputed territory. All right. Ultimately, the U.S. almost gave up all claims to the Mississippi River in the future to Spain just to get the Spanish harassment to stop. That would have been the Jay-Gardoqui Treaty. Fortunately, at the last minute, the Americans decided not to sign it. Otherwise, that would have been disastrous, and we would have lost any claims to the Mississippi River in the future. All right. France even picks on us. Our old allies, our buddies in France. Why? Well, they want their freaking money back. They loaned us millions and millions of dollars during the war, and they demand repayment of that money after the war. When we struggle to repay it back because our economy is so bad after the war, they get angry, they get frustrated, and they take it out on American ships. They actually cut off trade with us in the Indies as well. They basically said, hey, if you're not going to pay us off our debt, we're not going to trade with you. Which is actually a dumb thing to do when you think about it, because trade was one of the ways Americans were making money at the time, and if you cut off our trade, that means it's going to be harder and harder for us to pay our debts back to you in the future. Anyways, the moral of this story is, for England's picking on us for certain reasons, Spain's picking on us for some reasons, France is picking on us for some reasons, shoot, even no-name countries you've never heard of were picking on us. There were North African countries that were picking on us. They were known as the Barbary States at this time. When American ships would travel into the Mediterranean to try to trade with European countries, these North African Barbary states would have their ships intercept the American traders and seize their cargo, capture their sailors, and hold some of those sailors for hostage. Now, this would have never happened in the past when we were still British, because the British Navy would have protected these American merchant ships. But we don't have the British Navy anymore. In fact, we don't really have a navy of ourselves to protect our merchants, and so everywhere our merchants go, they kind of get harassed, they kind of get picked on. And these North African pirates, these Barbary states, were seizing our cargo, they were capturing our sailors, they were holding our sailors for ransom, and the U.S. was having to pay millions of dollars to get these sailors back. This was an embarrassment. These are not powerful countries that are doing this to us. These are little podunk countries that nobody's ever heard of before. But because we're the new kid, because we're so weak, because we're just getting started, even other small countries could challenge us and pick on us and harass us, and oftentimes there was very little that we could do. All right? So things are a mess in the early to mid 1780s under this new system, the Articles of Confederation, after the Revolution has ended. So again, lots and lots and lots of challenges here from all sides, not to mention our economy is wrecked after the war, and we've got major challenges with that as well. And the biggest problem here is, if you have a strong government, if you have a government that can fix these problems, this isn't a major issue. This is something that you can overcome. You can address each one of these things, one after the other, after the other, after the other. The problem is, our government at the time, the Articles, was incredibly weak. Why was it weak? Because the people who wrote it intentionally made it weak. They wanted most of the power to go to the states. They didn't want a federal government to have too much power because they worried that power could be used against the people, just like the King of England and Parliament had just done to them. And so, when they created the Articles, it was a weak system of government. All right, they had really very little authority over the states. They couldn't force the states to do anything that the states didn't want to. They're really just like a consultative body. What that meant was they were there to advise the states as to what they thought the states should do, but ultimately the states had all the power to make the decisions for themselves, and if a state didn't think that something benefited them, they voted against it. And so the Articles were really, really weak. It was almost like a friendship and not a government. All right. In fact, it took almost 3 years for the Articles to even be ratified. Why? Because states disagreed over what their own boundaries were with one another. And some of these states refused to even sign the Articles until these border disputes were settled. And so ultimately, it shows you how dysfunctional the states were at this time. Even though they've just won the revolution, they're not really loyal to one another. They're still really loyal to themselves. To the point where they didn't really want to work with other states a lot of the time if they thought that that would harm them in any sort of way. It took 3 years for the states to be able to figure out their own boundaries with one another before all of them agreed to actually sign the Articles, which ended up being a terrible government anyways. The biggest issues with the Articles of Confederation? Well, we've got a few of them. One, each state, regardless of its size, had one vote. That gave a lot of power to small states, which meant that they could pretty much block any action that other states proposed, even if an overwhelming majority of the people wanted a law passed or wanted a policy passed. Small states, which made up a very small percentage of the population, could actually block it. There was no executive branch. There was no president or anybody in charge to actually enforce the laws. So when Congress was able to pass laws under the Articles, and a state or an individual broke that law or didn't honor it, there was nobody there to punish them. There was no punishment for somebody that didn't want to obey the laws. That's chaos, right? Can you imagine if we had laws on campus at Catella, policies in place, and if you broke them, nobody actually enforced them? What would that do? That would just encourage you to break more laws in the future as well. Well, that's exactly what happened with the individual states. Since there's no president, there's no executive to enforce the laws, to make sure states follow them, then states just ignored laws or only followed them when it was convenient to them. Also, we had no federal judicial branch. We have no Supreme Court. So each state had their own court system. Oftentimes that meant they made decisions that benefited their state. And oftentimes, from state to state to state, the decisions that were made came into conflict with one another. So there's chaos in the judicial system. There's chaos in the political system. We have no executive to take strong control over the government. It's almost like, while the cat is away, the mice will play. And each of those mice, each of those states is kind of doing its own thing that they thought benefited it the most. Also, to pass a bill, it required 2/3 approval. Well, first off, to amend the Constitution, to amend the Articles, every single state had to agree to do so. That almost never happened because some states really liked this setup. They liked having all of the control. And so they did not want to change the system and give more power to the federal government so that it would take it away from them. In addition to that, bills required 2/3 vote in Congress. What that meant was, instead of majority rule, 51%, you had to get 2/3 of the states to agree to even pass a bill. So you had to have 2/3 of the states to pass a bill, which was very hard to get. You had to have unanimous support of the states to amend the Articles, which was impossible to get. They were never amended. Also, Congress was weak. They couldn't regulate trade, which meant they could not regulate, they could not resolve disputes between individual states about trade. They could not collect tax money, so they had no funds. They had to basically ask states for money. If a state said no, there was nothing they could do to get it. They had no way to force states to follow their laws, their federal laws, their national laws, because there's no enforcement capability there. Congress couldn't even raise an army. It had to ask states for troops in the event of an emergency. And so it's a reverse of what we have today, where our federal government is strong and our states share power but are weaker. In this time, the states had all the power. It would be like having a household where the parents are the parents, but they actually have no power. The kids decide everything. They decide when bedtime is. They decide when they do homework. They decide the meal every day. Well, hey, that would be good maybe for the kids, and the kids would like that system. But it would probably not be a very efficient and organized system, and I would argue that everybody as a whole suffers because only the interests of some people are being met. All right? So it is a mess. Let's do a little bit of review here before we move. And then we're going to finish. This will be our last review that we do. Everything else that we cover here, you folks are going to cover as part of our lecture notes, which we will begin on Tuesday in class. So finish up these last reviews for me, and that's where we are going to stop it today, and this is where we will pick it up when we start class on Tuesday. Hey, it's Mr. Majewski signing out. I hope this was effective to you, and have a great remainder of your weekend. Make sure you watch the video and go through these notes. By the way, the notes end towards the bottom of page 6, about halfway through page 6 is where you will stop with all of this. Take care.